In other news, high-risk tankers linked to sanctioned oil are increasing off Singapore's doorstep. Lloyd's list intelligence revealed at least 27 so-called shadow fleet vessels in the Singapore Strait as of today. Now, these ships move sanctioned cargo in defiance of global rules, typically using stolen identities to evade sanctions and scrutiny. The Maritime and Port Authority says it's keeping a close watch on movements and ship-to-ship transfers in Singapore's waters. Claudia Lim with more.
The Singapore Strait is a vital artery for global maritime trade. Each year, more than 80,000 vessels pass through this waterway, carrying a third of the world's traded goods. But while nothing may seem unusual from the surface, ship spotters like Remy Osman say they've noticed a growing number of so-called dark fleets. These are ships that carry sanctioned goods and use tactics to hide their activities. Remy takes me to one of his viewing spots for a better vantage point.
So when I started the hobby, there were almost none that I saw, but then particularly in the past year or two, I see them almost every single day. And that's because since the Ukraine war started and then everything that's happening with Iran and the Middle East, there are many, many more ships which are being sanctioned for taking oil from these countries and exporting them. And sometimes
Remy has been tracking these vessels for some years. He tells me these ships typically change their flags frequently, falsify their registration details, and sometimes even turn off their tracking systems. And as Remy explains this to me, we spot one sailing by.
Based upon where it is, you can identify it on the map, which is as this one. And then you'll notice it's called here. However, when you click through, it's changed its name to Latitude, which is its old name. It also claims that it's coming from this place in Malaysia, having left in the 14th of June. However, there's no way it would take several months to just get from Malaysia to come here.
And upon further investigation, Remy tells me that it's a zombie ship, one that's taken on the identity of an already decommissioned ship. According to one maritime intelligence firm, there are at least 27 shadow fleet vessels in the Singapore Strait and another 130 in the Riau archipelago. And while these sail through without stopping, typically to the South China Sea for ship-to-ship transfers, questions remain over what Singapore can do about them.
What they're doing is actually exercising their right of innocent passage through the Singapore Straits. And you have to bear in mind that the Singapore Straits is actually a traffic separation scheme that is adopted by the International Maritime Organization.
But while majority may sail through without issues, Mr. Raju adds that the problem arises when these ships, which are typically uninsured, meet with an accident. That could cause unintended consequences like oil spills, which could rack up millions of dollars in cleanup costs. Changing international laws, however, may not be so straightforward.
When the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was agreed by the parties, at that time we didn't have this problem of shadow fleet. We didn't even have transponders, So this problem was not in their minds. It was not envisaged that, we'll have these problems and then we need to address them.
Singapore fully implements the UN resolutions, including sanctions imposed through domestic legislations, while MPA monitors all vessel movements in Singapore waters. On that end, ship-to-ship transfers here without MPA's approval are not allowed. And it's working with neighbouring countries to combat illicit maritime activities in the Straits of Malacca and Singapore.
And for more on this, I'm joined by Professor Robert Beckman, who is the head of the Ocean Law and Policy Program at the NUS Centre for International Law. Professor, great to have you with us. Now, first of all, what is really stopping the authorities from cracking down harder on the shadow fleet in this region? Can you give us a bit of context on why they seem to be able to operate so freely?
Well, they have, under the Law of the Sea Convention, a right of what is called transit passage through straits used for international navigation. So they can go through the Straits of Singapore, or Straits of Malacca first, and then through the Straits of Singapore. And then they pass and they exit the territorial waters of Indonesia, and they anchor outside the territorial sea of Malaysia. They anchor in Malaysia's economic zone, and Malaysia is not regulating ship-to-ship transfers in that area.
Now, given the sheer volume of the ships that are moving through the Singapore Strait every day, is it realistic to think that this region can meaningfully police shadow and also these zombie tankers at all?
Well, it would be difficult, but it's not impossible. I think, as you saw earlier in this program, there is commercial software from several companies that are tracking tankers. This can be supplemented with satellite monitoring. And ships, when they enter the Malacca Strait, when they reach off Port Klang, they must report their IMO number and name. So they could be tracked as they come through the Straits of Malacca and then Strait of Singapore. And all three states could introduce penalties for spoofing their location or turning off their automatic identification systems as they come through. So it's not impossible, but it would be very difficult.
Now, in this case, how does international law then constrain or also enable these vessels? And what can Singapore do when these vessels pass near or call at our ports?
Well, when they're passing through the strait, there's very little that Singapore can do because they have a right of transit passage unimpeded through the strait. If they call on Singapore Straits, it's calling the Singapore port, it's an entirely different picture because Singapore could then exercise port state control and do an inspection and hold the ship up until it meets all of the IMO requirements. But the shadow fleet vessels, as far as I know, do not come into Singapore port, not only because the port dues are very high, but they may never get out because they're not in compliance with the IMO safety or pollution regulations. If the vessel were fraudulently registered, in theory, then if that were proven, they have no right of passage. They're stateless vessels, and even when they enter the Malacca Strait, they're in Indonesian waters. Indonesia, in theory, could arrest them and bring them into port. I don't think that's even been considered at this stage, but something that might be thought about in the future.
Right. Now, these zombie ships also, they spoof AIS, they rely on shell companies and sail under very dubious or fraudulent flags. Within the IMO and also the regional maritime forums, are there any concrete mechanisms that can close these loopholes, or would that require entirely new rules and new treaties altogether?
Well, the weaknesses of the IMO conventions is that they rely on flag state implementation to comply with the regulations, and the backup is port state control when the ship voluntarily enters into port. Now, the shadow fleet are avoiding these because they're being flagged in states that have no capacity or interest in ensuring they comply with the IMO rules, and they avoid entering ports like Singapore that would be subject to inspection. The IMO system for registering the ships is completely broken, and the legal committee of the IMO will be looking at this over the next couple of years, but it's going to take probably until 2027 or 2028 before they can straighten that out. Europeans are putting pressure on the small states where these ships are being registered to deregister them, and they're giving incentives and making threats for the states because they're now being registered in landlocked countries or tiny countries that have no capacity whatsoever to regulate them, and they have no interest in regulating them. They're simply doing it to make money. So ideally, there should be a new treaty, but for the IMO to do this, it's a very long-term process. There's no quick fix on this.
Yeah, let's take a look now at a bit more on the damage side of things. Now, if a largely uninsured shadow fleet tanker causes some kind of major oil spill in or near our waters, who would actually end up bearing the cost of the compensation and also the cleanup in practice?
Okay, very good question. In theory, the owner of an oil tanker must have compulsory insurance. The amount would depend on the gross tonnage of the tanker, how much oil they're carrying. But these tankers generally would not have insurance. If they do have an insurance, it's probably a clause in which they don't have to pay if there is a spill. So the so-called Civil Liability Convention is probably not going to work. The backup to that is another convention called the International Oil Pollution Compensation Fund, or IOPC Fund. That will come in if the liability under the tanker or the CLC insurance is not met, or if they don't have CLC insurance. Both Singapore and Malaysia are parties to that convention, so they could draw on the fund, which is paid for by all states that receive oil by ship. The difficulty in this region is Indonesia is not a party to the fund. So if there is a spill that hits Batam or Bintan or the Rio Islands, and the owner doesn't have insurance, Indonesia will be able to bear the entire cost of cleanup itself.
Now, Professor, before we go, do you think there's a specific role that Singapore can and should play when it comes to driving cooperation with our neighbours? For example, when it comes to data sharing, maybe joint surveillance, or even coordinated enforcement against these high-risk vessels?
Well, I think the three states could cooperate to try to protect the waters in this region. There is a mechanism called there's a TTEG, a tripartite technical experts group, but there's also a Straits of Malacca Cooperation Forum where they meet every year, and that's designed to deal with issues of either navigation improvement or prevention of pollution. So in theory, that could be worked out. But I think, as I explained earlier, it's only limited what the three states could do. But in my view, they could do more. I think one of the things they could do, for example, the tankers that are coming through the strait and then anchoring in Malaysia's economic zone, they're receiving food and water and spare parts and fuel from operators that are coming from one of the three littoral states, I think, either in Malaysia, Indonesia, or Singapore. So the three states could penalize or prohibit companies based in their territory from servicing these vessels, and therefore they would be much more difficult for them to do operations. Also, Malaysia should be able to extend its laws on ship-to-ship transfer operations to its economic zone. The MARPOL Convention, the International IMO Convention on this, allows the state to extend their laws to cover ship-to-ship cargo operations, a transfer of cargo under their laws, but Malaysia has not seen fit to do it. I think there's complications because if they extended it to economic zone, as I understand it, under Malaysian law, the Navy regulates economic zone, and the Coast Guard or Maritime Enforcement Agency regulates the territorial sea. But I think these issues could be overcome if the political will is there.
Professor, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. That was Professor Robert Beckman, who is the head of the Ocean Law and Policy Program at the NUS Centre for International Law.